Welcome back, guys. Sweet Chris here. And in this video, I'm going to take a look at the SuiteFoundation certification exam, which is the topic I get asked about more than anything else. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at what the test is, give you some tips on how to prepare for it, as well as some specific strategies for taking the test itself. So let's get into this. So the first question is, what is SuiteFoundation? SuiteFoundation is simply the catchphrase that NetSuite uses to describe their entry-level certification. They have many more levels above that, but SuiteFoundation is the first. And some jobs require you to be SuiteFoundation certified before you can even apply for the job in the first place. So the way that this test is structured is it has 65 questions and they give you 80 minutes to complete the test, whether you do it in person or what most people do, which is using an online proctored exam. So you have relatively a little more than 1 minute per question to get through the whole test. And it is a multiple choice question test. You usually have 4, if not 5 options, and you'll generally be selecting one, and sometimes they'll tell you to select 2 answers that are correct. Now, my comments overall regarding the test is that it is a relatively tricky test. Now, if you've got 5 or 10 years of consulting experience with NetSuite, you might not have a hard time at all with this test. But if you are a relatively new NetSuite user, the way that they created this test is not from a simple standpoint and also not from a practical standpoint. They're not asking you questions like, what is this tool and how would you best go about using it? The questions are a little bit more based on memorization and really just arbitrary information, such as if you go to the 4th subtab over from the right, 3 entries down, what are the 10 restrictions that you'll find there? Again, not the best way, in my opinion, to formulate a test, but that is the way they structured it. So you have to approach it from that standpoint and have a really solid understanding of the basics of NetSuite so that even when they're throwing some of these curveballs at you, you can kind of break down the question and still figure out what they're trying to ask and what are the most logical responses. Now, unlike some exams where at the end of it, you will have a concept of how well you did, NetSuite does not provide any of that information. So you'll simply be told when you complete the exam, whether you passed or whether you failed. No concept of percentage, no concept of passing rate, or on the questions you got wrong, what were the correct answers. They don't publish what the passing rate is. Based on the research I've done, I think it is around 70%, but it could be a little bit more or a little bit less than that. So that's just something to think with as you're going into this. Before I go any further, I'd like to say, if this video is helpful, please hit the like button and also subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. At this point, I'm now coming out with 2 long form videos every single week in addition to the short form videos that I make. And that's all on top of the course content that I make every single week for the Super Training website. So there's a lot of new content. If you'd like to keep up to date on it, please subscribe and let me know down in the comments below if you found any of this information helpful for you attaining your own SuiteFoundation certification. So let's dive into this. If you're thinking about doing your SuiteFoundation certification, you should be aware of the resources that are available to you to help you pass the exam. And really there's 2 that are provided every year by NetSuite themselves. One is called the study guide, and it basically lays out what you should expect to see on the exam. So they have 5 major categories and they split them down into roughly 40 subcategories. And in general, I'd say it's a pretty accurate reflection of what you will see on the exam. And they actually also distribute the questions quite evenly. So out of the 40 subcategories, each one will tend to get about 1 or 2 questions. Again, the final exam is about 65 questions. So they split it up pretty evenly. The only 2 exceptions I'd say is definitely go strong on roles and permissions and everything related to the home dashboard. Those 2 areas specifically get at least 5 to as many as 10 questions each. So it's important to have a very firm understanding of those 2 topics. And the second thing that NetSuite provides is a practice exam that has 50 questions that you can take, and they provide you the answers for those questions. Now, that's a great thing to do just to prepare for the test because it gives you a good concept of the types of questions that you will see on your exam. But don't expect to see those actual questions on your exam. You might have maybe 1 or 2 that overlaps from the practice exam to your own exam, but in general, it's going to be just a reflection of what you'll see on the exam. So now let's take a look at what is your timeline of preparation to take and pass the SuiteFoundation certification. And I understand that there's probably a broad range of people that are watching this video. Some of you might not have ever used NetSuite hands-on, and some of you might have been consultants for years and have simply never taken the effort to actually pass your SuiteFoundation certification. So I'm going to give you just the concept from the lowest level, and you can really reflect that on your own personal experience and decide where you fit into this overall timeline. So again, for a brand new person, my advice to pass the SuiteFoundation certification would be to start with my Basics of NetSuite course. It's a free course. It's probably about 4 hours, and it just gives a grounding on what is the system, where is everything, what do the tools do, and how to get some basic usefulness out of it. So it's a good crash course on someone that really has never used NetSuite before, has a very limited understanding. Once you've done that basics course, then I recommend that you get at least 3 months of experience actually using NetSuite. And that might come as a shock to some people who are hoping that they can just take a course, pass an exam, and then get a job using NetSuite. But the reality of it is that the NetSuite software actually takes quite a while to really get familiar with. And again, the test is not simple. It really takes what's an already complicated system and it tries to throw curveballs and very awkwardly worded questions. So I really don't think that unless you're a screaming genius, you're going to be able to come in with just a few hours of familiarity and pass the SuiteFoundation certification. So at least a few months. I wouldn't even be surprised if it takes 6 months or maybe even a year to really get familiar to the point where you feel comfortable taking the final exam. Now, once you've got that familiarity underneath your belt, at that point, I would recommend taking not just this video, but I'm coming out with a SuiteFoundation prep course, which is going to be coming out probably in 1 to 2 weeks. And it'll be a few hours long and really just get you 100% familiar with what's going to be covered in that course, as well as some overall strategies for passing the exam. So once you have that familiarity, you can then take the prep course. And at that point, I would take the practice exam, get through that. If you get anything wrong on it, look at those areas, try to shore up any weaknesses that you have, retake the practice test maybe in a few days or a week later, the point where you've kind of reset and you can look at the questions newly. And at that point, you should feel pretty confident with the practice exam and you'll be ready to go on and take the final exam and most likely pass it. Now, I should comment on the use of exam or question dumps, which, if you've never heard that concept before, it's basically a repository that you can find online that allegedly has questions that you will find on the final exam. So the idea is you can get familiar with what the exam is ahead of time and then ace it when you finally come to it. And so in preparation for this video and for the course that I'm making, I actually downloaded a number, almost a dozen different question dumps from websites like Udemy, Course Hero, Quizlet. And what I found was that the question dumps fell into one of 3 categories. Either one, they were totally disrelated from the actual test. They had typos in the questions and the answers. They were obviously made by someone unscrupulous and had nothing to do with the test. The second were really actually just NetSuite provided practice tests, either from the present year or from past years. And those are totally fine. Obviously, it's better to do the most recent test, but there's no harm in looking at the older tests. The last category, of which I only found one, was actual question dumps showing questions that you would find on the final exam. They have obviously gotten it through either stealing one of the exams or recording it illegally on a screen and then recording those information and putting them on this website. But the problem with that, even though it were legitimate questions, they had answers provided with them that were completely incorrect. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, NetSuite doesn't tell you what you got wrong or what the correct answers were. So the people that were stealing these exams don't know what the right answers were. So they provided what they thought were the correct answers. And I found in the vast majority of cases, they got it wrong. So you have to be very careful. If you're insistent on looking for one of these question dumps and using that as an additional resource, you have to be wary of what's being provided to you as the correct answers. Unless you're getting it from actual NetSuite tests where they provide you the correct answers, I would completely disregard any answers that are correct and simply look at the questions, get familiar with them, and figure out for yourself what are the correct answers. The last thing I'd like to do in this video is actually walk through a couple examples from the practice exam and give you a concept of some tips that you can use to better take this test. Because in my opinion, there is a science to test taking. And even if you have an understanding of the material, if you have a skilled or an experience in test taking, it will give you a massive leg up. So I'm going to give you 3 tips on how best to do a test. And the first tip, and in my opinion, the most important, is when you're dealing with a multiple choice exam like this, your objective is not to choose the correct answer. Your objective is to eliminate all of the wrong or the least likely answers. And that will hopefully bring you down to either one answer or at least 2. So that strategy, and again, I'm going to show you how that works in a second, but that is very important in terms of increasing your probability of getting correct answers. The second tip I can give is use logic and basic reasoning when you're going through this test, especially this one, because they throw you all these curveballs, they use odd wording. It really serves you well to try to look at the questions from a logic standpoint to eliminate things that are clearly illogical or incorrect. And the last tip I can give you is to keep momentum. As you're going through the exam, you always have the ability, especially if you're doing the online version, to basically put a question aside and move on to the next question. And if you think about the fact that you have roughly a little over a minute per question, if you find you're getting stuck on one question for 5 or even 10 minutes, you're gonna fail the test just right away. So you want to take those questions that are harder or that you're not getting a grasp of what the question's asking, put it to the side, move on to the next question. Once you get through the main test and you've answered all the easy questions, you can easily double back on the harder questions and tackle them at that point. And that's great for a number of reasons, but one of the additional benefits is the fact that you might run into a question early on that you didn't understand or you didn't know what it's getting at. As you've chewed through the test, you've been really thinking about NetSuite, you've got a lot of different other questions probing your knowledge. You might come back to that first question and suddenly see it in a moment of clarity and be able to answer that. So I highly, highly recommend that you don't get stuck on any one point. You keep moving through. Every minute or so, you should be moving on to the next question, if not sooner, and then double back on those tougher questions the second time around. So let's take a look at 2 particular questions on the practice exam and use those as a guide for how to use these tools. So here we are in the SuiteFoundation practice exam, and this one is for 2023. So you might have a more recent one, but let's take a look at a couple of these questions. The first one is question 9. What customization feature allows users with no scripting knowledge to modify standard NetSuite processes? So this question, again, this is a good example of how the questions aren't always so straightforward in terms of understanding what they're talking about. But if you boil it down, they're saying, what's the feature that is a customization feature that allows people that don't know programming to change or modify a NetSuite process? So let's look at the answers. We've got Suite Builder, Suite Flow, Suite Bundler, and Suite Talk. Now, you may or may not know what some of these are. Hopefully, you know at least a few of them are, but you might not know all of them. So if you got these questions, you have to basically look through them and do process of elimination and some basic logic to whittle the list down to at least what you think might be pertinent answers. So first off, the one that you most likely don't know, at least if you're not a programmer, is Suite Talk. That one is specifically for people to do integrations from third-party systems into NetSuite. So if you came across this feature, odds are the answer is not the one thing that you've never really heard of. So it's pretty safe bet to chalk off Suite Talk and hope that it is one of the ones you actually recognize. Next up from that, we have Suite Bundler. Suite Bundler, you might not be familiar with it, but you should have at least heard of it. Suite Bundler and Suite Apps are basically the methods that you can use in NetSuite to install or bring in either third-party apps or other plugins or bundles, things like that. But again, those are installations, not necessarily changes. So that kind of wording you just need to kind of pay attention to. They're probably, if you're talking about making modifications to NetSuite processes, they're not necessarily talking about Suite Bundler, or it's less likely. So why don't we chalk that off the list? And we're now down to Suite Builder and Suite Flow. If you didn't know anything more than that, you could flip a coin and the likelihood is 50% you would get a right answer. But if you knew at least a little bit more, you would know that Suite Flow is related to the workflows of NetSuite. That's really their catchphrase for that. And you could guess that workflows are related to the processes that NetSuite deals with, as opposed to Suite Builder, which tends to work a bit more with forms and records and customizations like that. So that's where these two things split. And just that little difference in wording is leaning in the direction of SuiteFlow. So even though you might not be sure, you could take that logic and apply it to selecting SuiteFlow as the more likely choice, in which case you would be correct. So that's it for question 9. Let's take a look at one more. If we come down here to question 14, I want to use this question because I think it's a good reflection of how silly some of these questions can be, where they're really asking questions that nobody really ever needs to know to be able to operate in NetSuite. If you had to find out what restrictions are in some specific location, you could always just go to that location and look them up. But they're trying to find out what things you've memorized in NetSuite, so fine. How can we approach this question from that standpoint? And the question is, which restrictions can apply to records on the Home Set Preferences Restrict View tab? So this is a perfect example where I can't even tell you what's on that tab, and I'm pretty familiar with NetSuite. I know in generally what that tab is for, but I don't remember exactly the different features that are enabled on there. So even if you don't know what's there, you could still look at this and go, the options are period, segment, location, and department, and you have to choose 2 of them. So periods are basically months, right? Like January, February, those are all periods. Segment, if you watch any of my other videos, you should know that a segment is the same thing as a classification in NetSuite. And that is, there's 4 in general. There's classes, locations, departments, and subsidiaries. You can also have custom segments. So any one of those 4 things is technically a segment. And then you see location and department, which are 2 segments, individually put down below. So from a basic process of elimination and logic standpoint, if there's a restriction that's going to apply to 2 things, the odds are it's going to apply to the 2 things that are siblings, which is location and department. So again, even if you have never been to that tab and you have no idea what's on it, you can still look at this and have a pretty safe bet that location and department is the correct answer. Because the only other really feasible option would be to select period and segment. And those 2 things don't really go together. Period is for accounting generally, and segment is really a broad classification. So it could be period and segment, but the odds that it's going to be location and department, which again, they're like little siblings, along with subsidiary and class, it's much more likely it'll be those 2 than it will be period and segment. So with no other understanding, you could apply that logic and most likely get this question correct. And that's all I've got for this video. I wish you the best of luck in doing your SuiteFoundation certification, and I'll see you in the next video.